Okay, thank you very much for your patience and for being here, and thanks for having me here. I'm thrilled to be here and to be able to talk about the work we've been doing in the area of childhood anxiety disorders. I don't have any significant disclosures to make and no conflicts of interest. I should make one disclosure, though, which is that I am a researcher. And that means this presentation is going to be a little research heavy and maybe a little bit dense, but hopefully you'll bear with me, and I hope that it'll all come together. Also, being a researcher, one of the questions that occurred to me and was actually triggered by a conversation that I had has to do with the roots of NVR historically. Now, we often attribute this movement to other movements, geopolitical movements like the work of Gandhi in India. Well, earlier this year, or last year, I was in India doing a presentation, and someone made, I wouldn't call it a sarcastic comment, but maybe I could, because it was, you're here from, you have this kind of Middle Eastern background, and you're here in India teaching us about nonviolent resistance. Didn't sit that well, so it led me to think a little bit more about the roots of NVR, and I realized that Israel is, in fact, the cradle of nonviolent resistance. And I point you to the first book of Kings, chapter 12, that describes, for those not familiar with the ancient history of the region, it describes the disintegration of the kingdom of Israel following King David and then his son King Solomon. And then following King Solomon came another king, Rehavam in Hebrew. And he was known for what has caused many revolutions around the world, taxation. He was a particularly enthusiastic taxer of the people. And this led to a revolt, which ultimately led to the splitting of the kingdoms into two kingdoms, that of Judah in the south and that of Israel in the north. But what's interesting is the way that revolution occurred, in a non-violent way. I will try. What's interesting about the revolution in this context is the way that it occurred. It was an almost completely non-violent revolution. Is this better?
Yeah.
We can have slides or we can have voice. Which do you want? In fact, it was a really simple revolution. What did they do? They stopped paying the taxes. They just refused to recognize the king and said, we're just not going to pay those taxes anymore. And that was it. There was one victim recorded from the entire revolution. Who was it? It was the person in charge of collecting the taxes, who got stoned to death, because there's a limit to everybody's good nature. And furthermore, what also occurred to me as I was thinking about this is that the very border between those two kingdoms, the place where this was actually occurring, is right there, in the ancient city of Jaffa, today's Jaffa, Yafo. So there we are, 3,000 years, almost exactly, 3,000 years of nonviolent resistance in the city of Jaffa. So, having said that, what else was I hoping to talk about? Well, what I really want to introduce you to is a parent-based treatment for childhood anxiety and related disorders like obsessive-compulsive disorder. And it's founded, it has its roots in nonviolent resistance. And I'm going to try to make the case for why another treatment for anxiety and why a nonviolent resistance treatment for anxiety. I'm going to delve briefly into a few neurobiological clues that have guided this work and also stemmed from this work. I'll tell you about the intervention and a little bit of some of the results from clinical trials that we've been conducting in this area and some of the future directions that we're taking it. And I realize time is short, and so I'm going to try to go quickly. Why another treatment for anxiety disorders? Very simply, these are the most common disorders across the lifespan, in childhood, but also in adulthood. Most people with anxiety disorders have their onset in childhood, regardless of when they are diagnosed. And our current treatments are just not good enough. These are remission rates from the seminal, rigorous clinical trial for childhood anxiety disorders. These are remission rates if you look at the combined treatment using both an SSRI and also cognitive behavioral therapy, you have a decent remission rate. If you look at the monotherapies, each of them individually, you don't really have terrific remission rates. And that is not even the whole story, because if you actually look and you split that up by children who have more severe anxiety coming into treatment versus those who have less severe anxiety, what you'll notice is that the kids come in with not that bad anxiety do okay, regardless of treatment. The kids who come in with severe anxiety really don't do very well. These are our two frontline treatments for childhood anxiety disorders, CBT and SSRIs. That is what's out there. And they really are not doing that well. In fact, if you look at those high anxiety kids, the more severe kids, for them, neither one of those monotherapies, CBT alone or SSRI alone, actually do significantly better than placebo. Neither one of them beat placebo, so to speak, when provided alone. But even together, it's really not good enough. And so we need more treatments. And for a long time, people have thought, well, why not work with parents? And there's lots of good reasons to think let's work with parents in childhood anxiety. There's lots of research tying parental traits to childhood anxiety. Not to say parents cause anxiety disorders, but certainly there are associations, and children who are anxious tend to also have anxious parents. There's all these reasons pointing to work with parents. And there's been about 25 studies that compared individual child-based treatment only to an augmented treatment condition where kids got the individual therapy and also got the parent therapy. And these are the results. By and large, it just has not mattered. Adding parent work to child treatment for anxiety has not improved outcomes. You can see the growing frustration in the field. These are ordered chronologically. You can see how 2005, listen to how carefully people were wording this. There's not sufficient evidence to conclude with confidence that adding parents as co-clients is uniformly superior. This is really diplomatically put, because what they didn't want to say is it didn't help. But it didn't help. And then you go 2008, parental involvement was similarly efficacious as parental non-involvement. And finally, in 2012, you just throw up the hands in the air and say, why parent involvement has not enhanced outcomes? Because that has been the conclusion. Now, what should we take from that? What does it mean? Well, one possibility is that we are wasting time working with parents, and another possibility is that we should be thinking about what are we doing with those parents? Well, what are they doing? There's lots of books and manuals and treatment protocols out there, and I can summarize to you what parent work in child anxiety has been by and large. It's been a combination of let's teach parents to do CBT for their kids. That is the most common approach. Or let's treat the parent's own anxiety. Or let's just give parents some generic parenting skills. Let's make them better communicators or better problem solvers. Well, if you do those things in addition to child therapy, you don't get better results than if you just do child therapy. Put another way, if your kid's going to do the CBT and get better, they'll do it with the therapist. If they're not going to do it with the therapist, they're not going to do it with mom or dad either. Well, what else can we do? And why nonviolent resistance? Well, the answer, there's kind of two ways to that I think about, where this treatment came from, one of them is the more fancy, theoretically driven one, and one of them is the more practical. But let me start from the fancy one. And it has to do with our basic biology. You see, anxiety disorders are special in a really important way. All problems that children have tend to affect their parents, right? If you're a parent, your kid has a problem, that's probably going to affect you. If they have a dental cavity, that's going to affect you. You've got to take them to the dentist. You have to deal with their pain. It's going to affect you because you're the parent. Look, everything your kids do affects you, right? When my children liked Buzz Lightyear, Buzz Lightyear, right? When I bought underpants, I bought the Buzz Lightyear underpants. Now, maybe that's a symptom of something, but the fact is, yeah, we're in a relationship. There's an effect. But anxiety disorders are special. They don't just affect parents because, of course, we're parents and so it matters. They affect us in special ways that are deeply rooted in our biological mammalian nature. Because we are mammals. And mammals are born, like many other species, are born pretty helpless, not very good at defending themselves. And so what does a young mammal do when it senses danger? Does it try to fight off the danger? No. It signals a caregiver, right? If you walk up to a baby and scare that baby, there's a baby here somewhere. Let's do an experiment. No. If you were to walk up to that baby and scare them, and scare that baby, they wouldn't try to punch you. What would the baby do? It would signal a caregiver. It would cry, cling, because that's how mammals respond to danger. What does that mean? It means that if you have a psychological disorder where the core feature is chronic activation of your threat detection system, you're going to chronically activate that signaling behavior, right? You're going to chronically signal your parents, I'm in danger. And you're going to look to them to provide what parents are heavily motivated and wired to provide, which is protection and regulation. And so an anxiety disorder at its core is a parent-involving treatment in a way that goes beyond just like having a cavity. It is a systemic interpersonal problem. Well, if it's a systemic interpersonal problem, then we have multiple avenues for intervention, multiple doors to walk through to intervene. We can work with a child, and that works, you saw, in X% of the cases, but we also can work with other parts of that system. And because children are relying on their parental responses to those signals of fear, it means that in working with the parents, we don't need to train parents to do CBT to their kids. How do you get your child to do exposures, or practice breathing, or do cognitive restructuring, and all those great things that work really well for lots of kids? You don't need to get your child to do anything. You just need to change what you do. Well, this is starting to sound like an NVR-style problem, right? We're pretty familiar with this kind of an approach, where we can focus on changing a parental behavior and lead to changes in other parts of the system. Anxiety is ripe for this because it is so inherently interpersonal. It's a small step from that mother holding a baby in the most natural and healthy way to an anxious child who's clinging constantly to that parent and seeking constant reassurance or constant protection, or, as we usually talk about it in the anxiety domain, they're seeking accommodation of their anxiety symptoms. Family accommodation is basically all those ways that you as a parent are making changes in your life to help your child not feel anxious. How many percent of parents accommodate their child if they have an anxious child? Guess? Yeah, it's about 100. That's right. 150. The numbers range between 95. The numbers range between 95 and 100, and we've studied this all over the world. In India,
in Japan, in the United States, in Israel, in South America, we always come up with the same magic number of about 97% of parents. If you have an anxious child, you're going to accommodate that anxious child. That is what we're supposed to do, right? We're supposed to respond to child fear with protection, with regulation, with soothing. We're designed to do that. But anxiety hijacks healthy systems. That's what it does. It does it at the individual level, like when it gets your heart racing in a way that's appropriate when facing a real danger, but inappropriate when facing an imaginary danger. And it does it at the parent side. It takes that healthy behavior of parental attachment and bonding and responsiveness and sensitivity to your child's cues and runs away with them so that soon your whole life is circling this child's anxiety disorder. I could give you endless examples of this. Let me give you one, because I know that time is short. It always sticks in my memory, but we could go on and on with examples. Here's one. This is a family of a child who was about 8 years old and had a fear of spiders. And he was so scared of spiders that he would do lots of things. He would search his room for spiders before going to sleep. He would close all the windows. He would keep a light on because maybe the spider won't like it. And because he was an 8-year-old boy, he also thought, if I want to be safe, the very last thing I have to do before falling asleep is hear my father say, "Good night, son, and I love you very much." Now, there's no evidence that spiders care if your father loves you or not, but it's an attachment signal, right? Dad saying, "I love you," is an attachment behavior. It reduces anxiety. So he's going to sleep. He calls his father in. He says, "Dad, could you say, 'Good night, son, I love you very much'?" And his father felt good and said, "Of course. Good night, son, and I love you very much." And he walks out. And if the child had instantly been asleep, that might have been fine. But of course he's not. He's still awake. And he has another thought, and maybe a thought about the spider, so now it's ruined. So he calls his father in again. "Can you say it again?" "Okay, sure. Good night, son. I love you very much." Walks out, calls him in again. Walks out, calls him in again. When I saw them, I asked them, "Please count. How many times are you saying, 'Good night, son, and I love you very much'?" They told me it was a lot, but they didn't know how many. Well, they counted, and over 7 nights until our next meeting, they were averaging 120 times per night. That is about 2 or 3 hours of "Good night, son, and I love you very much." And let me tell you, it might start out, "Good night, son, and I love you very much." When you're at 120, it does not sound like that. You can fill in for yourself what it might sound like. If it was my kid, I would throw the spider on his stupid face. Because think of all the energy, all the resources that are going into this, that are not being spent on important things like watching Netflix. It's taking over your life, and that is what it does. And is it reducing the anxiety over time? No. Anxiety is getting worse. We have studied this intensely, and you see this consistently. More accommodation, more anxiety. This slide I owe to, I'm going to laser point Yara over there, who designed this slide, but it really captures the cycle that you'll see. You have anxiety, you seek, as you're intended to do, parental protection, reassurance, soothing, regulation, etc. Your anxiety goes down, but you remain entirely dependent. What you don't have is a sense of being able to regulate your own anxiety. So next time you feel anxious, you go around the circle again, and it's spinning faster and faster. Okay, I promised to briefly delve into some neurobiological research in this area. Let me tell you two things. There's a classic brain imaging paradigm where you take people, you put them in a scanner, fMRI, a magnet scanner, and you look at their brain response to threatening faces. And healthy people and anxious people, but anxious people more, will show a response in that part of your brain called the amygdala that tends to control fear response. If you show scary faces or angry faces, you'll see the amygdala light up in children, in adults, and more so in anxious kids. That's well established. We did a slight variation on that. We took children and we put them in the scanner and we did the exact same thing, except we did it twice. One time, as it's usually done, the child's alone in the scanner, as is always done, and you see the amygdala light up. We did it a second time, same thing, but now the mother is standing there holding the child's hand. They're not doing anything except standing there and holding the child's hand. Well, that pink bar is the child's amygdala reaction to the scary faces when they're alone. The bar you can't see is their response when the mother is standing there holding their hand. What you see is a really powerful anxiety-reducing effect of parental proximity. Now, we know this behaviorally, right? Again, these are threatening faces. I'm not suggesting that you cannot scare a child who's holding a parent's hand. Of course you can, but what you get is a significant reduction. Essentially, what this is saying is a child has two ways to regulate fear. They can regulate fear by doing things like reassessment, breathing, other coping skills, or they can regulate fear through parental proximity and accommodation. And in fact, when we looked at the degree of difference, how much effect that parent being there had, it was neatly correlated with the level of family accommodation reported by both the parent and the child. And so what we have here is a brain marker of children's dependence on accommodation for regulating anxiety. Another brief detour into our biology has to do with this hormone, oxytocin. You can see spinning around there. That's my foot. No, it's not my foot. I do not have an oxytocin tattoo on my foot. But why do people get an oxytocin tattoo? Why can you go on Amazon and buy an oxytocin molecule necklace? Because oxytocin has become famous as this kind of love hormone. And in fact, it's true. It is involved in close interpersonal attachment and affiliative behavior, not only between couples, also between parents and children. But oxytocin also plays important roles in anxiety regulation. And it's not surprising that we would have a hormone that has a foot in anxiety regulation and a foot in attachment behavior, because that's what we've been describing, is the interplay between our social interpersonal behavior and our anxiety regulation. And so, not surprisingly, we were very interested, and we are very interested in this particular endocrinological and neurological system. I say both because oxytocin is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone, meaning it acts both in the brain and in the body, outside of the brain. And so we started measuring oxytocin in the saliva of children coming in for anxiety treatment. And what you see is a pretty neat correlation between the level of oxytocin in the child's saliva and the degree of accommodation that they're reporting and their parent is reporting of their anxiety symptoms. Children with low oxytocin levels are reporting higher levels of dependence on parental proximity. And it led us to an interesting hypothesis, which has to do with separation anxiety in particular, because separation anxiety was the disorder that was most tightly linked to the oxytocin functioning. And maybe that's not surprising, because separation anxiety is, if anxiety disorders are interpersonal, nothing is more interpersonal than separation anxiety, where the whole thing is I don't want to be away from my parent, right? And in fact, what we saw is that children with separation anxiety had significantly lower oxytocin levels than children without separation anxiety, even though they were anxious too. And it led to the hypothesis, maybe what we think of as separation anxiety is an attempt by a child to regulate a low-functioning oxytocin system. And so that made us think, well, if that's true, would we see an increase in oxytocin when the child is able to be with their parent? And so we had them spend a few minutes with their parents, and then we measured again, and in fact, that's exactly what you see. In children with separation anxiety, their oxytocin levels will come up to the level of children without separation anxiety if you let them spend 5 minutes with their mom talking in a positive, pleasant way and planning a fun day together. So how does this translate into treatment? Right? What I've tried to do is describe anxiety as an interpersonal problem and the parental component of that interpersonal problem as family accommodation. Well, what can we do about that? Well, we can work with parents to replace their accommodating behaviors with other behaviors. And that's what we do in this program. We call it SPACE, or Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. Done it with anxiety, OCD, some work now in other areas. But let me focus on anxiety in particular. In this work, we try to help parents to redefine their role away from my job as protecting a child who is anxious. Step away from that role of I need to step in and protect you. I need to be there to stand between you and the danger or to regulate you. And instead replace that with what we call supportive behaviors. What are supportive behaviors? These are supportive behaviors. You're being supportive when you're conveying to your child, I get it, I understand, you're really anxious. By the way, that's not trivial. Acknowledgement and validation of a child who's anxious, not trivial. I have 3 boys, one of them quite anxious. I'll be at home, I'll say, go upstairs and get your thing. He'll say, I'm scared. I'll say, no, you're not. And then I think like, idiot. I've done this talk like a million times. It's so reflexive to try to tell the child, no, you're not scared, or no, it's not scary. What do we really mean? We really mean you don't need to be scared, or it's okay, or you'll be fine. But often what comes out is not very supportive because we're trying to tell the child they don't feel what they think they feel. Nobody likes that. And so we start by acknowledging and validating what the child is feeling, but combining that with a confidence in their ability to also tolerate a certain amount of anxiety, to cope. Now you notice how we haven't said anything about getting the child to do anything, right? That's why it lends itself so wonderfully to nonviolent resistance, because we can focus entirely on modifying these parental responses without making any demands on the child. If you tell a parent of an anxious child, you need to get your child to do this or that or the other, you're setting them up. You're setting that parent up. They're going to go home. Let's say the child doesn't want to be alone in bed. You say, well, you have to get them to be alone in bed. What's going to happen? They're going to go home. They're going to say, you have to be alone in bed. Child says, I can't. But the doctor said I have to make you, right? So I'm going to try to make you. And things escalate rather quickly. The child is now angry, and I'm angry, and I'm feeling helpless and ashamed because I'm not able to do this basic thing that apparently I'm supposed to be able to do. Or get your child to school when they're avoiding school because they're anxious. Or do anything. Get your child to speak in social situations. Or what about the child who's constantly asking questions because they're worried, they have generalized anxiety, and they're always pestering you with these reassurance-seeking questions. Are you going to get sick? Are you going to get divorced? Are you going to die? Are you going to this? Are you going to that? Am I going to get sick? What's going to happen? Try to get that child to stop asking. Not only will you not get them to stop asking, your very attempts are actually just as good for the kid as the answer that they look for. It's almost like you're answering anyway. When they say, are you going to die? And you say, I'm not going to answer that. They're almost as happy with that answer as they are with, no, I'm not going to die. And then they ask it again, and they want to hear it again. And so you've replaced answering 1,000,000 times, I'm not going to die, with answering 1,000,000 times, don't ask that. What can you do? You cannot try to change the child's behavior at all and just say, well, I'm not going to answer anymore. Say it once and walk away. Is your child immediately going to stop asking? No. But if you stick to that, they will. If you don't answer and you stick to that and you're able to cope with their responses and you don't get mad at them, because why should you get angry at them? What are they doing wrong? They're not doing anything wrong. They're just anxious and looking to you. Not only are they not doing anything wrong, you're the one that suddenly changed the rules. You always answered them, now you don't. Why would we be angry at them for asking again? That makes no sense. And so you can stay empathic and supportive because you're not trying to make them do anything. But try to stay empathic and supportive when you're telling them don't ask, and they ask. Now they're disrespecting you. Now they're not listening to you. Now you're failing at your mission. This is where NVR is such a powerful tool for working with parents in this way. We can just focus on these parental responses, and instead of accommodating, we give supportive responses, and we reduce the accommodation. Now, we don't just tell parents never accommodate again, because no parent can stick to that. We'll work through it with a little bit more thoughtfulness, and we'll pick a specific target. And those who want to learn more, I encourage to come tomorrow to the workshop that we're doing more in depth on the space program. But that is the essential. What you see here summarizes this treatment. Increase support and reduce accommodation. And what happens And of course, we'll use these tools that Chaim was just talking about. How do you tell a child? They apply just as much here. How do you go home and tell your child, I'm not going to answer again? And how do you deal with what if they say, well, I'll kill myself if you don't? How do you deal with what if they get angry at you? How do you get supporters to step in and say, I get it, you're so scared. This is incredibly hard. But your parents, their job is to help you, and this is how they're going to help you. We can take so much. But this is where, how much time do I have? You okay? This is where I get to the second answer for where this treatment came from. I told you there's the nice research theory-driven mammalian biology, fMRI, blah, blah, blah answer. But there's also the more pragmatic answer, which goes to about, several years ago when I was working in Schneider Hospital alongside many of the friends here in the room. And I had two jobs there. I was working in a CBT anxiety disorders program for children, and also I was working in the parent guidance program for parents of children with severe disruptive behavior problems. Now, one of my jobs in the anxiety program was to screen new phone calls coming in, because we had a wait list, and if you've ever tried to run a clinical program, you're always fighting that wait list. And so one of my jobs was to try to screen the parents and when they called on the phone, and I would ask them a very simple question. I would say, does your kid want treatment? And if they said no, I would say, well, you can go on the wait list, but really CBT requires a ton of motivation and collaboration, and if they don't want help, we're not going to be able to help them. But on that same day, I might then find myself an hour later in the parent unit saying to parents of children with severe problems, we don't need the kid here. We're going to help you. We're going to empower you. You're going to have all the tools to make a change. And then I run back to the other office and say, sorry, we can't help you if your kid's not here. Well, it started getting a little bit frustrating. This makes no sense. How do we have so much expertise in working with parents of severe behavioral problems, and we can't do anything for these parents of children who have anxiety and don't want to come in for treatment? And this really drove us to a very fruitful process of thinking with Chaim Omer, with other colleagues, and really thinking through what can we take from all of the knowledge that we have in working with these parents in the behavioral problem domain. What can we take from that? Acknowledging these are very different problems. And at that point, I wasn't even thinking about the biological, mammalian stuff. I was just thinking, how can it be that we can't do anything for these parents? And it turns out that you can. We've done 3 clinical trials at this point of space. 2 were open trials. And as a researcher, I would say open trials are not a good test of efficacy of treatment. Open trial, meaning everybody got the treatment and there's no control comparison condition. They're not really good, strong tests of efficacy because generally speaking, if you give somebody a treatment, they're likely to say they got better, regardless of what that treatment is. But they're still informative. We did 2 open trials. And what was special in those trials, one was in anxiety, one was in OCD. What was special is that we specifically selected for those trials children who refused CBT or had done CBT and failed to respond. Now, if any of you do clinical trials, you know these are the kids you never want in your study. Because everybody knows that treatment refractory kids are recidivists. They're repeated offenders. If they didn't respond to one trial, they're likely to not respond to another trial. And so generally, people will have, literally in the criteria for their selection, they'll have, did not do another trial and fail or drop out because you don't want them. Well, we selected them purposely and explicitly because we wanted to answer the question, could this be not just another way of working with kids, but could it help us to work with other kids who couldn't benefit from our current treatments, like CBT or SSRIs. These were small open trials, but they went really well. We had very good response. Kids got better. And this led us to do a much larger randomized controlled trial of space where we took 120 children and randomly assign them to either only space with 0 child therapist contact or only CBT with 0 parent therapist contact, apart from very brief check-ins a few times over therapy just to tell them, your kid's progressing or something like that, but no parent guidance. What you see on the screen now are only the space outcomes right now. The top row, these are parent report, and these are child report, and this is anxiety. So what you see is the children in space, right, they had no therapy sessions, but they're telling us, not only are the parents saying they got better, the children are saying, my anxiety went down, and the accommodation went down. This was done by independent evaluators, not by a therapist who's providing treatment. When we compare results for the children in space and for the children in CBT, look at that line. I don't know if you can tell, if you're sitting far away, those are 2 lines. The blue is, what is it? Let's see. It doesn't matter. It basically doesn't matter. They're the same line. There's, thank you. The blue is space. But literally, who cares? Because it's the same line. In other words, based on both child and parent and independent evaluator report, children are getting better to an equivalent degree when they receive no parent therapy or when they receive no child therapy. This is amazing. We never set out to show that space would be better than CBT or that space would be as good as CBT. We just wanted to show we can effectively treat children. To find that it's working as well is actually quite remarkable. And let me just circle back really briefly before I summarize to what I told you before about the oxytocin. And if you remember, I mentioned that the low oxytocin levels in children with anxiety disorders and in separation anxiety in particular. But what you see here is change in oxytocin over the course of treatment. And you can see here it does matter what color line. The blue is space, you can see that going up. As you're working on that interpersonal aspect of the child's anxiety, and in CBT, there's not it looks like it's tilted downward, but that's actually not a statistically significant change. So it's essentially stable or maybe trending downward. And so this leads to the next study that we are about to launch, and this is going to be another clinical trial of space. But here we're going back to the fMRI. You remember that brain marker? That impact of the parents holding your hand on your brain's response to fear? Well, can we modify that? What happens to that if a child gets a treatment like space? Will we see a reduction in the difference between mother is present and mother is absent over the course of space? What would that tell us? It would tell us that we're engaging a brain system by reducing accommodation. We're engaging a brain system that allows the child to better regulate their own anxiety independently and is less dependent on the interpersonal aspect, on the parent's presence. And so with that, I want to thank the many, this is not, I guess, everyone, but many mentors and collaborators and friends and colleagues, and in particular, I want to thank Yara Shimshoni, who is here and has done more treatment with space than anyone, and Meital Orbach, who is our wet lab, and each and every one of you. Thank you very much.